Hi Ninja Nerds, in this video we're going to talk about structures of the heart. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up, comment in the comment section, and please subscribe. Also, we do have an Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and check out our website, ninjanerd.org, where you can get whiteboard lecture notes and illustrations just like this. All right, let's get started. So we're going to talk about structures of the heart, but real quick, let's talk about the function and where the heart is oriented. What is the function of the heart? Function of the heart is to do what? Pump blood. You're like, yeah, Kristen, pump blood. Super and easy, quick, to the point. More importantly, it's to pump blood to the rest of the body. And that's why the orientation of where the heart is really important. So where is it? The heart is located in this area called the mediastinum, which is located here in the thoracic cavity. It's broken into many parts, but for the purpose of this video, it's in the mediastinum. Within the mediastinum, it's located along this line right here, which I've already written here as the midsternal line. And it's actually shifted 2/3. So 2/3 of the heart is actually to the left. So we're going to write here 2/3 to the left of the midsternal line. Okay? And what you want to also note is that when it's also shifted 2/3 to the left, it's also slightly on an angle, with that angle being the apex of the heart here and the base of the heart here. So we have the apex that points to the left hip area, and we have this base to the right shoulder. Okay, so it's to the left, slightly on an angle, and it's about the size of a fist. All right. Typically, that's usually 200 to 300 grams. Okay, so that's where the heart is, and it's really important because the heart actually has two circuits. So let's talk about that really quickly. It has a pulmonary and a systemic circuit. What does that mean? Remember we said that the whole point of the heart is to pump blood. But what does blood do? Blood is to bring nutrients and drop nutrients off. So the circuit is really important because the heart is going to pump blood, and we have this blue line here. This blue line from the heart going from here to the lungs, right? It's called our pulmonary circuit. What does this blue line mean? Blue line means deoxygenated blood. So the heart in this circuit is going to pump deoxygenated blood into the lungs. What happens in the lungs? We get oxygen, baby. So that oxygen now gets pumped back into the heart and then to the rest of the body. So we have the oxygenated blood to the body. What happens in the body? The body takes that nutrients, it takes that oxygen, it uses it in the vital organs, and then it has to go back to the heart. And that's how our circuits work. They go from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart, back to the body, back to the heart, okay? So I want you to understand that because we have basically two circuits, but they are in the heart. And that's how we're going to delineate where we are when we're identifying structures. So let's move down into here and look at our heart, look at our diagram. Let's just orient ourselves really quickly. Let's just set up some parameters. If you're taking a test, you can write this down really quickly, just so you don't start messing things up. So we're on this side, but remember, this is a mirror image, or if I'm standing like this, it's this side of my body, so it's going to be the right side. So let's make sure we write up here. This is our right, and then over here, and this is our left. And what are these two bigger blue structures here? What's on either side of our heart in our thoracic cavity? Those are our lungs. So just remember, this light blue here is our lungs. So we have our lungs, we have our heart. Now that we're a little more oriented, let's try to identify some structures. The heart has 4 chambers. And what are chambers? Chambers are these pockets or these openings that blood can flow into that gets ejected out or squeezed out of. So let's identify these 4 structures. Number 1 here is on the right side, so that's easy. And it's above, okay, or it's this opening that we call the atrium. So this first chamber is the right atrium. Below it, still on the right side, is the right what? What is a chamber below the atrium? We call that the ventricle. Now that you've identified the right side, the left side is very easy because it's the same stuff on the left side. So we have the right atrium and the right ventricle. So what's this one? The left atrium and the left ventricle. So easy. Great. Now let's move into valves. So what are valves? Valves are these things right here. I have them noted a couple times with different numbers because we're going to identify each one. But valves are these little flaps, right? This is what they look at from the side, these little flaps that open and close to allow blood to go one way through, but not prolapse or regurgitate back out. So we have valves that separate all of our chambers or openings or exits out of the heart. The first one here, the right atrium to the right ventricle. There's a valve here. You see that? See this blue valve? Number 5. What is that? This is called the tricuspid. Okay, so we have the tricuspid valve. And that separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. So blood, right atrium, through the tricuspid to the right ventricle, and it's going to go up and out this here and go to our lungs. So if we're going to our lungs, what's the word that we use for that circuit? We use pulmonary. And this valve right here is the pulmonary valve, or depending on what facility you work at, they may call it the pulmonary semilunar valve because it's got a crescent shape. But for the purpose of this, it's the pulmonary valve. So we got the right atrium through the tricuspid, right ventricle to the pulmonary valve. Great, so we have those 2 valves on the right side done. Let's talk about the 2 valves on the left side. Remember, valves are between 2 different chambers or between an exit point of the heart. Left atrium has to go down through a valve to get to the left ventricle. What is this valve called? You know? This one is called, actually it's 2 names, so it's like a trick question. It's mitral or the bicuspid valve. Okay? So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to say mitral, but just know that some places like to call it bicuspid as well. Both are right. So left atrium goes through the mitral valve, down to the left ventricle, and up, and it's going to go through this big structure here, right? This big structure. Now, we know that this big structure, right, is going to pump through our systemic system, but we don't call this the systemic valve. What is this big structure here called? It's the aorta. So this is the aortic valve. Okay? So we know that the left atrium goes through the mitral valve to the left ventricle, up through the aortic valve. Great, wonderful. So we noted the chambers, we noted the valves. Let's talk about how blood gets in and out of the heart. So we know that the word artery means taking blood away, and we know that vein means taking blood back to the heart. So let's identify some structures now with that. We have this one here. We have number 9, number 10, and number 11. It's hard to see it, but it's right here. These 3 dump blood into our right atrium, and they have names. What are they? First, this one up here is above the heart, and it takes blood from above the heart back into it. So what's the word that we use in anatomy that means above? We know that's superior. This structure is called the superior vena cava. Blood comes through this vein from the upper portion of our heart back into it, right into the right atrium. We also have this deoxygenated blood coming from the inferior part. Guess what? This is superior vena cava. This is our inferior vena cava. So both of these are coming. They're bringing blood from the superior and inferior portion and dumping it into the atrium. But there's one other spot that we didn't talk about. What's the part right in here? What are all these over top on the outside of the heart? There's little vessels. What do we call those little vessels? Do you know? Those little vessels are called coronary veins, coronary arteries. So this little opening here that takes the coronary veins and coronary arteries blood and dumps it back into the right atrium to go through the circuit and get pumped through the body is called the coronary sinus. Make sense? Great. So superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and coronary sinus drop blood into the right atrium, goes through the tricuspid, goes to the right ventricle, goes to the pulmonary valve. From there, we have this big blue structure. What's this big blue structure here called? Remember, we're going through the pulmonary valve out to the lungs. This one right here is called the pulmonary. And because it breaks off into a left and a right, we just call this portion the trunk. Okay, so we have this pulmonary trunk. It breaks off into a left and a right. You see it's on both sides? Why? Because we're going to the left lung and the right lung. What does that mean? If it's the pulmonary trunk and it's going away from the heart, you already know the name of it. You already got it in your head. This is the pulmonary artery. We are going away from the heart. Remember, specifically this one's the left and this one is the right. We'll just put right pulmonary artery. Okay. So we got our pulmonary artery. We're going away from the heart to the lungs, the pulmonary. We're getting oxygenated, and now we need to come back. When we come back into the heart, what is that word? What's that mean? Vein, right? So what are these structures called on both sides? These are the pulmonary vein. Particularly, this one's the left, and this one is the right pulmonary vein. Right, great, wonderful. We're taking these pulmonary veins. They now have this oxygen-rich blood, and they're coming into left atrium. Left atrium going through the mitral valve, through the left ventricle, up through the aortic valve, into the, you got it, what is this called here? Aorta. Right, and we know that the aorta is broken into many portions, the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, and the descending aorta. Before this video, we just need to know that's the aorta. Now we're out in the body. Great, wonderful. We're doing all our stuff and we're coming back in through our vena cavas. But we have other structures that we need to identify yet that we haven't talked about. And they're important because they keep blood in the left ventricle, and blood in the right ventricle there, and atrium in the atrium, and down in the ventricles as well. So let's talk about them. First thing is this right here, this big chunk of meat right here through the middle. What is this called? Well, it's between the ventricles, the right and the left ventricle. So what do we call this? We call this the interventricular, right, between the two ventricles, septum. Septum just means between two cavities. So the interventricular septum is between the two ventricles. You better bet that there's another one. I just can't draw it in this diagram here. But there's an area between the two atriums, or the atria. What's that called? The interatrial septum. Just keep that in mind because that helps later along the line when we have diseases or issues or murmurs that we're talking about. Those are where those holes, those openings that aren't normally there can occur. All right, so we got the interventricular septum. It's between the two ventricles. We got one or two other structures really to talk about so that we can identify what's going on with valves. So you see on this one here, this purple, this number 17, these lines, right? See these squiggly lines? You know what those are called? I'm going to draw, they come through and they attach to these muscles. What is that purple structure called? These are called our chordae tendineae. And these are our heartstrings. So these are our tendons that are attached to these muscles here that we'll identify, and they go to this valve. And they clamp on this valve to allow the valve to only open like a pinball flipper, but not go up and prolapse. So remember, these chordae tendineae play a special part in the heart's anatomy and physiology because if these tendineae aren't working, then this valve may prolapse. It may let blood go back from the ventricle to atrium. That's a no-no. We don't want that. Remember, too, we have this tendineae, this tendon that's attached to what? The last one here that we need to talk about on our diagram. These big red muscles right here. Do you know what those are? Those are our papillary muscles. And remember, muscles like to do what? They like to contract. So when these tendons, the heart starts to fill, right? These ventricles are starting to fill, and these tendons, I like to picture it like this. You have the heart filling here and you have a chamber, right? And these two flaps are opening up. This flap is connected to a piece of string on this muscle. And as it opens, or as it starts to close, as the blood starts to fill, it creates tension. And that muscle starts to feel a little tension. What does that muscle want to do? The muscle starts to clamp down, pull on it a little bit, because it doesn't want the valve to prolapse up. Just remember, so we're always trying to keep blood in the right chamber. We're not trying to go back through. One-way flow through the heart. Good. Let's talk real quick about those valves. Just so you know, because some people can't see this when they hear the names, there's a couple different types of valves. Some that look like this and some that look like this. So these are cross-section cuts of the valves. This has 1, 2, 3, and this has 1, 2. This is for you to just understand that the tricuspid, the aortic, and the pulmonary valve have 3, so that when the valves open and close, these tendonae are all connected on these lips here, and allows it to only let blood through one way. But the mitral, or the bicuspid, we'll put mitral here because that's the word we like to use. The mitral valve only has 2, just for an understanding there of the words and the naming process. Let's go talk about the layers real quick and wrap this up. All right, Ninja Nerds, so we're going to take this chunk out and we're going to look at all the layers of the heart. Just want you to understand that this is a small portion that we're blowing up so we can zoom in and you can look at it. This layer of the heart, the first one we're going to talk about is the endocardium. The endocardium is a lining of the chambers. So it goes around the valves, it goes around the ventricle, the atrium, and it gives this nice lining to the blood in the heart, so it allows the blood to move nicely. This lines the inside chambers, the endocardium. Next is the myocardium, this big red portion here. And you can see on the heart here, big chunk, and it actually is blue for this side. But what the myocardium is, that's our heart muscle, our cardiac muscle. And that allows for that the contraction of all those ventricles. And I want you to note, too, on the heart, that the left ventricle's got a thick one compared to the right. And that's because the left ventricle, remember, has got to pump through that aorta to the rest of the body. So it's a lot thicker on the left side. From here, some places may call it the epicardium, but the other name for it is the visceral pericardium. The visceral pericardium is the area, or the epicardium, on the outside of the heart. And you can see that there, depicted through the heart. So we have the endocardium inside, the myocardium, the muscle, and the epicardium, or the visceral pericardium, that's on the outside. The reason we call it the visceral pericardium is this is also the layer that is touching the heart, or touching the organ. So when we have cavities of the heart, those cavities fill with fluid, and there's a portion of the cavity that is touching the heart, or the organ, and a portion that's touching the rest of the body, or the cavity wall. So what I want you to understand is that the next 3 we talk about are kind of one unit together. So we have the visceral pericardium, the portion that's going to be touching our organ, and it creates this cavity, like I said. And this cavity is where our serous fluid, we call it the pericardial cavity. You know that serous fluid is a fluid that our body makes. It's all over. And what it does is it allows for friction to be reduced, right? So that when our heart is pumping, especially because our heart's pumping all day long, it's moving around, it's pumping a lot, we don't want friction to occur. When there's problems with the fluid or problems with any of these layers, that's when we can have other conditions or illnesses or disease processes. So visceral pericardium, that's touching our heart, the pericardial cavity that's got our fluid in it, and then we have our parietal pericardium, or the area that's touching the cavity, right? And I want you to understand that this cavity is created because it's this big bubble, and if you look at our diagram here, you can see we have our visceral touching the organ, we have our parietal pericardium touching the outside, but you're going to see right here that it does transition. It just loops in from one side to the other. It's still the pericardium, right? It's still one layer. It's just got 2 different portions, one that's touching the organ and one that's touching that cavity. The last thing we're going to talk about here is this brown layer. This is the fibrous pericardium. This is a very important layer because it anchors our heart in its spot, right, in our cavity, so it's not bouncing all around when we're doing stuff. Also, when it's moving, it's not moving all around. Prevents it from overfilling because the pericardium, the fibrous pericardium, is actually made of a connective tissue that's really dense. And what it does is it regulates the heart, it prevents it from overfilling, meaning if the heart goes to push against it, it's not really going to move, which is great for anchoring because we don't want it. But the last thing it does, the most important thing too, is it protects. And that's what I want you to make sure you know about that. Because it's so fibrous and it's so anchored and it's so rigid that it's able to protect our heart as well. All right, Ninja Nerds, one last thing before we go, and it's something that I used when I was in anatomy to help me remember what these structures are, just so I can, maybe get the answers right on the test. And it's something I would jot down. But you may be wondering what Mr. Whiskers or Vice President Whiskers is doing right here. So when I was learning the heart, I always wanted to remember some portion of it, and especially the valves. They always kind of messed me up and I couldn't remember which one was where or whatever. So I always remembered RATVP, or the rat vice president. Really easy. The right atrium goes through the tricuspid to the ventricle, we're still in the right, so into the pulmonary valve, right? I don't know. It made sense to me. It's kind of silly, kind of weird, but I really enjoyed it and I thought it really helped me. So then I wouldn't forget that the tricuspid and the pulmonary were the right side, and then by default, the mitral and the aorta were on the left side. All right, Ninja Nerds, that's it. I hope it made sense. And as always, until next time.